There is a specific kind of shame that does not come from failure. It comes from success, from stability, from having figured out, more or less, how to keep life together. It arrives quietly, usually in an ordinary moment. Sitting in a meeting, signing a contract, saying something carefully diplomatic instead of something true, and catching a flicker of recognition. This is exactly what I said I would never become. Not a villain, not a monster, just this. Careful, measured, willing to compromise in ways that the younger self would have found unforgivable. And underneath the stability, underneath the routine that works and the responsibilities that are being met, there is something that almost nobody talks about openly. A grief. Quiet, private, a little embarrassing. The grief of having grown into a person the younger self once looked at and said, "Not me. Never me." This is not a video about whether that younger self was right. It is not a simple celebration of selling out, or a simple condemnation of it either. It is something more honest than both of those things. It is about sitting with the full weight of what growing up actually costs, and about what to do with the parts of the original self that did not make it through. Before going deeper, a quiet note. If this kind of conversation reaches something that does not often get named in daily life, subscribing to this channel keeps this space close. These are not the conversations that productivity culture makes room for, but they are the ones that matter when the achievement is done and the question underneath it all is still unanswered. Every person who reaches a certain age carries a version of a promise. It was not always spoken out loud. Sometimes it lived in the music that was listened to obsessively at 15. Sometimes it lived in the way authority figures were looked at with a mix of pity and contempt. Sometimes it was very explicit. I will never be like that. I will never trade my dreams for a salary. I will never choose safety over truth. The younger self had a moral clarity that felt absolute. The world was legible. People who sold out were weak or cowardly or had simply stopped caring. The line between integrity and compromise was sharp and bright. That clarity was real. It was not naive in a simple sense. It was the clarity of someone who had not yet been handed a bill for their ideals. Because the bill eventually arrives. It arrives in the form of rent that needs to be paid, parents who need support, medical expenses that do not care about artistic principles. It arrives in the form of a mental health crisis that requires stability, not adventure. In the form of a body that cannot run on passion alone when passion does not pay for groceries. In 2026, the pressure is particular. The cost of living in most places has made the follow your dream narrative almost cruel in its simplicity. The gap between what I love and what pays enough to survive is wider than it has ever been. And the people who appear to have bridged that gap effortlessly on screens and feeds and highlight reels are showing the result without showing the compromise it required. So the choice that once looked like weakness starts to look, from the inside, like something more complicated. The stable job that the 20-year-old self would have called selling out becomes the thing that keeps the lights on, keeps the mind stable, keeps the people who depend on that stability from falling. And one day, without a clear moment of decision, the person in the mirror is wearing the exact pragmatic skin that was once worn as a costume for everything to be avoided. One of the most uncomfortable parts of this realization is not just the change itself. It is the echo of having been someone who judged, who looked at the boring adults and felt quietly superior, who was certain that the future self would do better, be truer, compromise less. Now standing inside the life that was once pitted, and there is an almost poetic irony to it. It is the kind of irony that is genuinely funny for about 3 seconds, and then quietly devastating for much longer. This is what the first section of this grief looks like, the mirage of the sellout dissolving. The realization that the categories the younger self used so confidently, rebel and sellout, dreamer and drone, pure and compromised, were too simple. That the world does not arrange itself according to the moral certainty of a teenager. That stability and integrity are not always opposites, even if they once looked like it. But acknowledging that the categories were too simple does not make the grief go away, because something was genuinely lost. The cost of the safety net is real. There is a particular kind of creative energy that exists when there is very little to lose. When the rent is low or non-existent, when there are no dependents, when the consequences of a bold move are mostly personal and recoverable. That energy is not just youthful naivety. It is a genuine cognitive and emotional state that allows for risk, experimentation, and a willingness to fail publicly without catastrophic consequence. That state becomes harder to access as responsibilities accumulate. Not impossible, but harder. The stakes are higher. The buffer is smaller. The consequences of instability spread outward to other people. So the creative rebellion gets deferred. Later, when things are more settled. Later becomes a horizon that keeps moving. The deferred version of the self begins to feel less like a plan and more like a ghost. And the corporate mask, or whatever version of it the current life requires, stops being something that is consciously put on each morning and starts to just be the face. The default mode. The automatic setting. This is when the guilt tends to arrive. Not loud guilt. Quiet guilt. The guilt of choosing a steady paycheck over a risky dream. Not once in a dramatic moment, but in dozens of small, ordinary decisions that accumulated into a life. The guilt of having priorities that would be unrecognizable to the person who was at 19. The guilt of finding genuine comfort in things that were once actively mocked. There is a specific version of this guilt that deserves to be named carefully. The guilt of being relieved by stability. Because the relief is real. Having a stable income, a predictable routine, a sense of groundedness after years of chaos or financial anxiety is genuinely good. The body relaxes into it. The nervous system exhales. And then the mind looks at that exhale and says, "Is this who we became? Someone who is relieved by ordinary things?" The answer is yes. And that yes is both completely understandable and genuinely worth grieving. The grieving of the radical self is a process that most people go through alone, without language for it, without permission to take it seriously. Because the culture tends to present two options: either celebrate the maturity and be grateful for the stability, or romanticize the lost youth and be consumed by nostalgia. Neither option allows for the full complexity of what is actually happening, which is a genuine mourning for a version of the self that was real, that had value, and that did not survive the crossing into adult life intact. The digital world adds a particular cruelty to this mourning. Old posts, old messages, old photos, old creative projects shared years ago, these things do not disappear. They sit in archives and memories and notifications, occasionally surfacing like time capsules from the previous version. And sometimes, looking at something created or written at 22, the feeling is not just nostalgia. It is something more unsettling. A recognition. That person had something that is harder to access now. A rawness, a directness, a willingness to be wrong loudly in public. And it is genuinely difficult to locate where, exactly, that was traded away. There was no single moment of decision. There was no contract signed. It happened in the space between decisions, in the accumulation of small pragmatic choices that individually seemed reasonable and collectively formed a kind of slow funeral. There is a moment that many people can identify, looking back, when pragmatism shifted from being a tool used occasionally to being the primary identity. When being responsible stopped being something done as a practical necessity and started being something performed as proof of having arrived at adulthood. When the safety of the known became not just preferable but definitional. That moment is worth locating, not to punish the self for it, but to see it clearly. Because once it is visible, the question changes. Instead of "why did I become this?" the question becomes "what does this serve now, and what has it cost?" This is where reframing becomes possible, not in a way that dismisses the grief, but in a way that adds complexity to the story. The younger self was not wrong to have ideals. Those ideals contained something true, a belief in the value of authenticity, in the importance of not just going along with whatever the dominant system offered, in the idea that a life should be more than a series of safe, optimized decisions. But the younger self was also working with an incomplete picture. The choices that looked like cowardice from the outside often looked very different from the inside. The boring adult, who kept steady work and paid their bills reliably, may have been carrying something that made the alternative genuinely impossible. A history of trauma, a responsibility to others, a health condition, a particular set of circumstances that left very little room for romantic risk. The judgment of youth tends to be made in the absence of that information. And re-encountering those old judgments from the other side of experience carries with it the uncomfortable gift of compassion. Compassion for the people who were once dismissed as sellouts. And, more difficultly, compassion for the current self. Because changing is not betrayal. Adapting is not surrender. The mind that can hold complexity now, that can tolerate ambiguity, that can make decisions in conditions of imperfect information without collapsing into rigid ideology, is not a diminished version of the young idealist. It is, in some ways, a more capable one. The problem is not the capability. The problem is when the capability comes at the cost of the values that once animated everything. When pragmatism becomes not a skill, but a substitute for depth. When the mask is worn so consistently that the face underneath starts to forget it exists. This is where integration becomes the real work. Not choosing between the rebel and the realist. Not performing the rebel to feel young, or performing the realist to feel mature. But genuinely bringing both into the same space and asking what each one knows that the other does not. The younger self knew something about urgency. About the fact that time is not infinite, and that waiting for the right moment to live according to values is a strategy that tends to fail. That directness has cost, but it also has integrity that the current self can learn from. The current self knows something about sustainability, about the fact that burning everything down for the sake of a principle is sometimes genuinely heroic and sometimes just expensive in ways that take years to repair. That patience and strategy are not always cowardice. Sometimes they are wisdom. Bringing these two into conversation, rather than letting one simply overwrite the other, is how the grief begins to resolve. Not by pretending the loss did not happen, but by finding ways to honor what was lost without abandoning what was built. Practically, this can take many forms. It might mean finding one area of life where the old creative directness is reintroduced, not as a grand gesture, but as a small consistent practice. A creative project with no professional justification. A conversation where the diplomatic non-answer is replaced by a genuine one. A cause or value from the younger self that gets real time and energy, not just a like on someone else's post. It might mean using the position and stability that was so hard to build in service of the things that the younger self actually cared about. This is what can be called strategic subversion, not abandoning the structure, but redirecting what it is used for. The platform, the income, the credibility that came from years of work, used to open doors for things that would have mattered enormously to the 20-year-old who was certain the future self would never stop caring. And it might mean, at the most fundamental level, forgiving the self for the distance between who was promised and who arrived. That forgiveness is not simple. It requires sitting with the grief long enough to take it seriously, rather than immediately reframing it into something more comfortable. It requires acknowledging that something real was lost, that the defiant, uncompromising, slightly unreasonable younger self had genuine value and deserved more than to be quietly shelved in the name of practicality. But it also requires something else, the recognition that survival is not nothing. That making it through difficult years with enough stability to still be present, still be curious, still be asking these questions at all, is a form of success that the younger self's framework had no category for. The most honest version of this journey is not a story of selling out or of triumphant growth. It is something messier and more human than either of those. It is a story of a person who started with clear ideals, got handed a complicated world, made the best decisions available at the time, lost something precious in the process, and is now trying to figure out how to carry both the loss and what remains. That person deserves more compassion than the younger self was capable of offering, and more honesty than the adult world typically allows. The middle ground between the rebel and the realist is not a comfortable place. It does not have the clarity of either extreme, but it is the place where real life actually happens, where values and practicality have to negotiate, where the grief of becoming is held alongside the dignity of having survived. And slowly, in that middle ground, it becomes possible to be someone who honors the younger self not by becoming them again, but by carrying forward what was most true in them into the life that now exists. If this reflection speaks to a grief that has been difficult to name, the mourning of a self that did not quite make it through, this channel exists to hold exactly these conversations. The ones that happen in the space between who was imagined and who arrived. Subscribing is a way of choosing to keep this kind of honesty close, on the days when the distance between those two versions of the self feels widest. Liking this video helps it reach others who are sitting quietly with this same grief. wondering whether they are the only ones who feel like they failed some younger version of themselves just by growing up. They are not alone in this. Sharing it with someone who seems to be struggling with the same quiet morning, someone who occasionally says things like, "I used to care so much more," or "I don't know who I am anymore compared to who I was," might be one of the most honest gifts possible right now. And in the comments, one question worth answering honestly. What was one promise the younger self made that the current self has not kept, and what did keeping it would have actually required? Just naming it, without judgment, is already a step toward integration.